Welcome to the Snapshot of Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason by Michel Foucault, available exclusively on Scribd. Here we'll explore the key insights from Madness and Civilization, but don't forget, the full title as well as more than 1 million of the best books, audiobooks, and other snapshots are available on Scribd. Introduction. Today, society has little connection to those who live with severe mental illness. Instead, doctors bear the primary responsibility of healing and understanding patients. As a result, the mentally ill have no choice but to allow the doctor to function as the sole intermediary between the supposedly distinct worlds of sanity and insanity. However, the history of madness is far more complex than these oversimplified medical and social binaries might suggest. Mental illness wasn't always regarded with the same suspicion as it is today. Although madness remains a largely invisible phenomenon, it contains its own nuanced, shifting narrative. The history of madness conveys just as much about Western society's fluid definitions of normality as it does about mental illness itself. Conceptions of madness in the Middle Ages. During the late Middle Ages, insanity was a generally accepted component of public social life. Mad individuals intermingled with the supposedly sane, and it was rare for anyone to draw a firm distinction between the mad and the normal. Madness wasn't seen as an illness that required a cure, nor was it a cause for fear. No one thought to hide the mentally ill from the public eye, and insanity wasn't a qualification for denying individuals certain rights or privileges. Instead, madness was just another ordinary part of reality. The social acceptance of madness began to erode due to the changing needs of the times. This transition occurred in part because of the gradual disappearance of leprosy from the Western world. For centuries, lepers had functioned as general-purpose scapegoats. Cast out of the community and sent to dwell at the city gates or in one of the leprosariums that multiplied across Europe, lepers fed the traditional cultural rites of purification and exclusion. From the 14th to the 17th century, leprosy was an easy target on which to pin all of society's ills. The banishment of leprosy had important liturgical symbolism for the medieval church as well. One rite in particular, utilized by the Church of Vienne, depicted the leper as a sign of both divine anger and divine mercy. The leper, like the sacrificial Christ, bears the wrath of God. By being cast out from the church and society at large, the leper embodies the distance that Christ's sacrifice puts between humans and their deserved damnation. Furthermore, the leper attains their own strange communion with God by playing the part of the sacrificial lamb. In this way, the paradoxical rite attempts to reconcile Christ's preferential treatment for lepers in the gospel narratives with society's desire to cast out an undesirable other, to feel the intoxicating high of power, salvation, and stability. However, near the end of the 17th century, leprosy became increasingly scarce throughout Europe. This change may have occurred because the traditions of leper exclusion had successfully limited the spread of the disease. Whatever the cause, leper colonies that had once housed thousands of afflicted individuals were beginning to empty out. But although leprosy started to disappear from the social landscape, the structures of exclusion that had fortified the church and society at large were still in place. Consequently, the traditions of exclusion that had so shaped the life of the leper went on to repeat themselves within a different population subset. For the next 3 centuries, petty criminals, wandering vagabonds, and the supposedly deranged came to fill the social void that leprosy left behind, and mental illness became the new fodder for social exclusion. The Renaissance and the Ship of Fools. The first sign of this change in popular thought was the emerging popularity of the literary trope known as the Ship of Fools, a fictional vessel that shows up throughout literature and art during the late Middle Ages and Renaissance periods. The Ship of Fools is an allegory that dates back to Plato's Republic, which depicts a crew of sailors who are too busy arguing about leadership to pay attention to the ship's failing course. This image rose to prominence as a literary and visual trope during the Renaissance. After the Middle Ages, it became increasingly common for madmen to lead simple, wandering lifestyles because towns throughout Europe were more likely to cast the insane out of their communities. This custom was especially common in Germany. Town records for places like Nuremberg and Frankfurt showed an increasing number of madmen who were driven away or arrested by authorities. The mad were usually entrusted to groups of merchants and sailors who were tasked with taking the expelled onto their boats and dumping them at their new destination. Perhaps the ship of fools trope enjoyed renewed popularity during this time because writers and authors witnessed the allegory coming to life within their own communities. Thus, the ship of fools became both an artistic device and an honest reflection of reality. Like the banished lepers of centuries past, wandering madmen took on their own social utility. They were the sacrifice that made the rest of society seem holy, the discarded weak link that gave the community a false sense of strength and stability. As a result, the void left in leprosy's wake was filled once again. For centuries prior, madness functioned in literature and religion as a source of legitimate knowledge. Christ represents folly by accessing triumph via surrender and discovering life in death. Likewise, Erasmus, in his famed work In Praise of Folly, uses an anthropomorphized version of folly as a prophetic narrator who decries the limitations of human arrogance. Madness became a protest against the hubris of human certainty. Instead of leading humans astray, madness was a way of accessing the natural wisdom that arrogance and intellect often overlooked. However, throughout the Renaissance and beyond, madness lost its identity as a source of knowledge. Instead, it came to be associated with vice and human weakness. This shift reinforced the growing trend of banishing the mad. The rise of confinement. During the 17th century, more and more cities were building large houses of confinement. The quintessential example was the General Hospital of Paris, which, despite its name, wasn't a medical establishment. Instead, it functioned as an administrative, semi-judicial institution that housed the mendicant as well as the mad. In other words, the General Hospital became a catch-all facility for the city's most inconvenient citizens: beggars, vagabonds, the unemployed, and the insane. As an institution, the General Hospital was so effective in cleaning up the Paris streets that in 1676 the King of France signed an edict that called for the creation of similar establishments in every city in the kingdom. In the following century, confinement houses emerged throughout Europe, largely as police-based institutions. In addition to its function as a social panacea, confinement came with its own economic benefits. In times of reduced wages, high unemployment, and scarce currency, confinement houses put problematic residents to work, thereby serving the dual purpose of policing the unemployed and turning these idle populations into sources of cheap labor. During periods of economic prosperity, confinement houses offered free manpower, and during economic downturns, they policed the most vulnerable members of society, preventing violent uprisings and public agitation. Thus, the purity rights of excommunication also had lucrative applications within the context of commerce and economic growth. Thanks to this trend, madness developed a strengthening association with idleness. With their insistence upon work, confinement houses reinforced new ethical frameworks that praised productivity and dismissed idleness as the outcome of immorality. This link between curing madness and curing idleness added another ethical dimension to popular definitions of insanity. Waning productivity and the shame of idleness became yet another reason to vilify the mad. The definitions of madness. As madness developed a stronger association with the vices of sloth and idleness, it also came to be associated with unreason, No longer was madness viewed as a possible link to natural wisdom that could supersede the misguided hubris of human speculation. Now madness was seen as regression into a degradation of humanity's unique capacity for rational thought. Erasmus had once employed the concept of folly as a rhetorical teaching device, but centuries later both church and society viewed madness as a legitimate threat to the very qualities that separated humans from the rest of the animal kingdom. From the Renaissance into the 18th century, unreason had numerous manifestations. The two biggest culprits were passion and delirium. Before Descartes, passion was seen as the intersection of body and soul. It was the emotional realm made manifest and the space in which the disposition of the soul influenced the decisions of the mind and the work of the body. When people talked about the undue influence of human passion, they referred to the moments in which rage, sorrow, and lust led to unreasonable and self-destructive acts. The passions were also seen as a bodily phenomenon because without a body there's no sexual desire or pain. This era saw a rise in the use of medicinal spirits, which were used to calm the body, reduce tension, and minimize the influence of hot-blooded emotions. Passion also came to be seen as a possible cause for madness, and therefore the body became a mental health liability. This mindset reinforced the ubiquitous fear that madness was a threat to anyone, not just the wanderers and beggars who were unfortunate enough to be tossed into a confinement house. Delirium was the other popular manifestation of madness. Dreams, hallucinations, and dementias became signs of madness as they represented the unreasonable state of seeing representations that didn't exist. Thus, madness took on a twofold nature. It was the willingness to operate according to irrational emotions and to adopt inaccurate views of the world. Madness was a participation in nonsense in which human objectivity was entirely lost. The associative link between madness and unreason served a dual purpose. On one hand, madness became a concept that helped society make sense of behaviors that were difficult to analyze. Madness became a label for anything and anyone that didn't make sense. On the other hand, madness was also a tool for delegitimizing the people and ideas that were deemed as other. Madness was a tool for dismissing and oppressing the poor, underemployed, and sick. Indeed, any vulnerable minority that seemed to contradict traditional definitions of reason could be relegated to the status of a madman. Madness became a convenient tool for understanding the world and getting rid of anyone who disrupted that narrow world view. The Great Fear and the Rise of the Asylum. Around the middle of the 18th century, European society experienced a greater level of fear regarding the spread of madness. People spoke of mysterious diseases that plagued confinement houses, an image that gave rise to the notion of madness as a pathogen. Perhaps this fear was triggered by the fact that many confinement houses had once served as leper colonies, and the fear of contagion that haunted such geographical spaces had been applied to the new social ailment. Or perhaps the rumors of prison fevers and scurvy were grounded in reality. In any case, people across Europe developed a growing fear that madness could spread just as easily as any physical malady. This shift in public perception gave way to various reform movements. The purpose of this trend wasn't to limit the number of confinement houses, but to refine and improve them to minimize the risk that madness might spread. In 1776, a French decree proclaimed the importance of inspecting and resuscitating hospitals in need. During this era, European societies attempted to create medically grounded solutions that would prevent the spread of so-called moral decay. This era also saw a certain amount of public shock over the intermingling of criminals and the mentally ill within confinement homes. The concern wasn't that criminals might take advantage of the vulnerable. Instead, most people were afraid that the insane residents were infecting criminals who were still open to the benefits of rehabilitation. Beginning in the 19th century, greater efforts were made to separate the madman and the criminal. The result was an increased distinction between houses of confinement, which were especially remote and reserved for the mad, and houses of correction, which had porous boundaries with the rest of society and were reserved for criminals. This separation between madness and criminality also inspired the creation of the insane asylum, an institution even farther removed from society that represented the pinnacle of the confinement movement. The asylum left a far more isolating effect on its residents because it adopted certain patriarchal power structures. In the asylum hierarchy, the institution wields the power of a domineering father, while the patient retains a childlike disenfranchisement. Those who are deemed mad are deprived of the rights and privileges that normal citizens enjoy. In other words, the mad weren't just removed from society, they were deprived of their individual freedoms. The ever-changing attitudes on madness continue to have repercussions today, even for those outside the asylum. Those who display whatever symptoms currently fit the definition of madness experience the loss of individual dignity and freedom. Analysts and psychiatrists impose the same dynamic on their patients that the asylum cultivated for its residents. The message is a twisted, oppressive version of positivism, the conviction that any perceived oddity can and should be fixed, and only those in positions of power are qualified to do it. Thus, contemporary psychology has replaced the confinement movement by creating a renewed distrust for so-called madness, an asylum that resides not in geography but within the patient's own mental landscape. Conclusion. Over the centuries, public ideas about madness and insanity have experienced significant change. While madness was once a socially acceptable state, it is now used as a justification for excluding people and attitudes that go against the status quo. Today's definitions of madness and its many treatments still contain their share of moralizing and disenfranchisement. Instead of promoting paradigms of health, contemporary discussions of madness serve only to reinforce a standard of self-policing and self-censorship. About Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault was a French philosopher whose theories primarily addressed questions of power, knowledge, and social control. Thank you for listening to the Snapshot of Madness and Civilization by Michel Foucault, available exclusively on Scribd. If you liked what you heard, then make sure to explore the rest of our Snapshot library to continue gaining key insights from nonfiction books in a matter of minutes. You can find the full version of Madness and Civilization, as well as more than 1 million of the best books, audiobooks, and other snapshots on Scribd. All snapshots are copyright by Scribd, all rights reserved.